I still remember the first day I met Mike. We were in the third grade, and he had just moved to our small town. We became best friends almost immediately, bonding over our mutual love for baseball and video games. Over the years, our friendship deepened. We were inseparable, like brothers. But as time went on, something changed in Mike. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. I couldn't pinpoint what it was until it was nearly too late. It was late one evening, a cold October night, when things took a turn. Mike had invited me to his family's cabin in the woods for the weekend. We'd done it a dozen times before, camping out, telling ghost stories, and just enjoying the peace and quiet. But this time felt different. The air was thicker, and an unsettling silence enveloped the cabin. We arrived just before sunset. The trees around the cabin cast long, eerie shadows as the last rays of sunlight faded away. Inside, the cabin was just as I remembered, cozy, with a rustic charm. But tonight, the familiar surroundings felt oppressive. After dinner, we settled in the living room. Mike seemed distant, his usual chatter replaced by an unnerving silence. His eyes, once warm and full of life, now seemed hollow, as if something dark lurked behind them. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the crackling of the fireplace. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Mike suddenly asked, his voice low and almost a whisper. I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "I don't know, man. We've told enough ghost stories over the years. Why? You got a good one?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in closer, his expression grave. "I'm serious. Do you believe in ghosts? Or maybe, something worse?" His question sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you mean, something worse?" He sighed and looked away, staring into the flames. "There's something I've never told you," he began, his voice barely audible. "Something about this cabin." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What is it?" Mike hesitated before continuing. "My great-grandfather built this cabin. He was different. He dabbled in things he shouldn't have. Dark things. He believed he could communicate with the dead, but it wasn't just spirits he was contacting." I tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Mike. You're just trying to scare me." But he was serious. "I'm not joking, man. My family never talks about it, but I found his journal years ago. He wrote about summoning entities, dark spirits that demanded sacrifices." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sacrifices?" He nodded. "Animals at first. But eventually, he started talking about needing something more. Something human." I stood up, trying to shake off the fear. "All right, enough with the creepy stories. Let's get some sleep." Mike didn't move. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes. "You don't get it, do you? He's still here. His presence lingers. I've felt it. I've seen things. And now, he wants something from me." I tried to brush it off, but there was a growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. "Mike, you're scaring me. This isn't funny." He stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "It's not a joke. I can feel him watching us. And he wants me to finish what he started." I backed away, my heart pounding. "Mike, what are you talking about?" Before I could react, he lunged at me, a knife gleaming in his hand. I managed to dodge just in time, the blade missing me by inches. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair as I tried to put some distance between us. "Mike, stop!" I shouted, panic rising in my voice. "This isn't you." But his eyes were wild, consumed by something dark and malevolent. "I have to do this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "It's the only way to end it." I grabbed a poker from the fireplace, holding it defensively in front of me. "Mike, please. We can figure this out. You don't have to do this. He charged at me again, the knife flashing in the firelight. I swung the poker, catching him in the side. He grunted in pain but didn't stop. We struggled, the room filled with the sounds of our grunts and the clashing of metal. In the chaos, I managed to knock the knife from his hand. It skittered across the floor, landing near the fireplace. Mike roared in frustration and tackled me to the ground. We wrestled, each of us fighting for control. Mike, snap out of it. I yelled, trying to reach him through the madness. This isn't you. Fight it. For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He hesitated, his grip loosening. But then, his expression twisted into one of pure rage. You don't understand, he snarled. He won't let me go. Summoning all my strength, I shoved him off me. He stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around for something, anything that could help. And then I saw it, the knife, lying just a few feet away. I lunged for it, my fingers closing around the handle. I turned just in time to see Mike coming at me again, his eyes wild with desperation. I'm sorry, I whispered, and then I plunged the knife into his chest. Mike's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, I saw the real him again. He looked at me, tears welling up in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered, and then he was gone. I stood there, shaking, the knife still in my hand. The cabin was silent once more, the only sound the crackling of the fire. I looked down at my best friend's lifeless body, a mixture of grief and horror washing over me. As I stood there, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and I knew. The darkness that had taken hold of Mike was gone, but the cabin still held its sinister secrets. I left that night, vowing never to return. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still feel those hollow eyes watching me, and I wonder if the darkness ever truly leaves. My friend Brian and I had been inseparable since high school. We shared everything, classes, interests, and secrets. When we both got accepted to the same university, it felt like destiny. Our dorm room was a sanctuary of camaraderie and inside jokes, but little did I know, something sinister was about to shatter our bond. It started innocuously enough. Brian had always been a bit of a prankster, and I enjoyed his mischievous side. One evening, as I was finishing a late-night study session, he walked into our room, a peculiar smile on his face. Hey, Dave, he said, his voice unusually cheerful. I got us some pizza. Thought we could use a break. I looked up from my books, grateful for the distraction. Sounds great, man. I'm starving. As we ate, Brian kept glancing at me, his eyes darting nervously. I brushed it off, thinking he was just stressed about finals. But as the days went by, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, muttering things I couldn't quite catch. His usually vibrant personality seemed dulled, replaced by a haunted, hollow look. One night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Brian, what's going on with you? I asked, my voice tinged with concern. You've been acting really strange lately. He looked at me, his eyes wide and glassy. Dave, I need to tell you something, he whispered, his voice trembling. But you have to promise you won't freak out. Okay, I promise, I replied, though my stomach was already knotting with anxiety. He took a deep breath and began. A few weeks ago, I was walking back from the library when this guy approached me. He looked normal, but there was something off about him. He told me he had a proposition, something that would change my life. Brian's voice wavered, and he ran a hand through his hair. I was curious, so I listened. He said he was part of this secret organization that could grant immense power and wealth. All I had to do was agree to a few terms. What kind of terms? I asked, a chill running down my spine. He didn't specify at first, Brian continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But I was desperate, Dave. My grades were slipping, my scholarship was at risk, and my parents were pressuring me. So I agreed. I stared at him, my mind racing. And what happened next? At first, it was small things, Brian said, his eyes darting around the room. Cheating on exams, stealing from the campus store. But then they told me I had to do something bigger. Something terrible. The room seemed to grow colder as he spoke, the shadows lengthening around us. What did they tell you to do, Brian? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. They told me I had to kill someone, Dave. Someone close to me. I felt a surge of panic, my heart pounding in my chest. Who, Brian? Who did they tell you to kill? He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. They told you to kill me. Brian nodded, tears streaming down his face. I tried to resist, Dave. I really did. But they threatened my family, my future. They said if I didn't do it, they'd ruin my life. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, betrayal, disbelief. So what now? I asked, my voice shaking. Are you going to kill me? I don't want to, he sobbed. But I don't know what else to do. They're always watching, always listening. I feel trapped. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Brian, we need to find a way out of this. Together. We can go to the police, tell them everything. He shook his head vehemently. You don't understand, Dave. These people, they're powerful. They have connections everywhere. The police won't help us. I racked my brain for a solution, my mind racing against the ticking clock of our impending doom. Maybe we can disappear. I suggested. Leave school, leave town. Go somewhere they can't find us. Brian looked at me, hope flickering in his eyes for a moment before it was extinguished. They'll find us, Dave. They'll always find us. Days passed, the tension between us growing unbearable. Brian's behavior became increasingly erratic. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, he walked in, a strange look on his face. Dave, he said, his voice unnervingly calm. I'm sorry. I really am. But I can't do this anymore. I can't keep living in fear. What are you talking about? I asked, my heart sinking. I'm going to end this, he replied, pulling a knife from his pocket. I'm going to kill you, and then myself. It's the only way out. Brian, no. I shouted, backing away. We can find another way. We can fight this together. But he didn't listen. He lunged at me, the knife glinting in the dim light. I dodged, adrenaline surging through my veins. We grappled, the room a blur of motion and desperation. Please, Brian. I begged, trying to disarm him. Don't do this. His eyes were wild, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, Dave, he whispered. I'm so sorry. In the struggle, the knife slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. We both stared at it, panting, our chests heaving. For a moment, there was a tense silence, the only sound our ragged breathing. Then, the door burst open. Two men in dark suits stormed in, grabbing Brian and me. Enough, one of them said, his voice cold and commanding. This has gone too far. Who are you? I demanded, struggling against their grip. We're the ones who gave Brian his orders, the man replied. We've been watching, waiting to see if he would follow through. Brian looked at me, his eyes filled with despair. I'm so sorry, Dave, he whispered. Quiet, the man snapped. You've both made things very complicated. But no matter. We have other ways of dealing with disobedience. They dragged us out of the dorm, their grip unyielding. Panic surged through me as I realized the true extent of the danger we were in. We were being taken somewhere dark and unknown, where our fate was entirely out of our hands. In the end, Brian and I had tried to fight against forces far greater than ourselves. Our friendship, once a source of strength and comfort, had been twisted into a weapon of destruction. As we were shoved into a waiting van, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever escape the shadow that had fallen over our lives. The doors slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. Brian's sobs echoed in the confined space, a haunting reminder of how far we'd fallen. And as the van roared to life, I realized that our fight was far from over.